Chaotic scenes in Afghanistan as the Taliban takes full control. Videos circulating on social media showed hundreds of Afghans attempting to flee the country. Some attempts ended in tragedy.
Hello and welcome to Daily Mirror World Focus. I'm Iswaran Ratnam. As we look at the situation taking place in Afghanistan, joining me today on our program is the Afghan ambassador to Colombo, Ashraf Haidari, and the UN Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights, Karima Benyoun. Welcome to the program. Ambassador, I would like to start with you. What is the actual situation in Afghanistan right now? We know that the Taliban has actually taken control of the entire country. And when we spoke a couple of weeks ago, they were nearing Kabul, but we felt that there may be some sort of international intervention, especially with the UN Security Council meeting at the time as well. What has happened right now and where do things stand?
Well, we should start from humanitarian situation in Afghanistan, which unfortunately is grim. If you look at the number of internally displaced people has only increased, including protracted 5 million, hundreds of thousands recently displaced by the extremely violent offensives which took place in last time we discussed, unfortunately, where really the Afghan government disappeared, unfortunately, and nor has the international community stepped up to the plate to meet the remainder of the UN humanitarian appeal for $1.3 billion, which is about 30 to 40% met, which means because of the breakdown of state institutions across Afghanistan and a lack of access also to the internally displaced people and others affected by the recent offensives, and as well as COVID and climate. Remember that Afghanistan has also been hit hard by an expanding drought and climate-induced flash floods. So that's where Afghanistan stands. You also discussed or touched on the images of Afghans desperately trying to get out of Kabul, and those are Afghans who have worked with the government or with the embassies in Kabul or the rest of the international community over the past 20 years, which have helped us achieve most of the gains that we have had, and unfortunately they're being undone, especially the rights of women, as we already see women being unfortunately worried and panicking even more than others, simply because there will be the primary victims have already been, and especially of now what is unfolding. Of course, there have been assurances and a general amnesty announced, but not only that remains, behind the mics and podiums and words from the leadership, but the reality on the ground is very different. We saw the protests today. Afghans trying to express their feeling by raising the Afghan flag, but unfortunately the Taliban opened fire into this civilian crowd, killing several and wounding many. And so we see these things as very tragic events affecting the poorest of the poor at a time when over 20 million people of Afghanistan are facing this grim humanitarian situation.
So from what you're saying, Ambassador, one would get the impression that the people or the public in Afghanistan have absolutely no faith in the Taliban.
Well, because the Afghan people have experienced the Taliban once, and they haven't changed. If they've changed for the worse. They're only more radicalized, lethal, destructive. We just saw them recently across Afghanistan, especially areas where we had been resisting, since the announcement by the Biden administration to withdraw their forces. And so Afghans are not just, saying these things for the sake of saying or fearing for the sake of fearing. They're very justified based on the Taliban's past in the 1990s up to 9/11. And remember the destruction of the statues of Buddha that took place in March 2001, which we discussed last time as a cultural, unfortunately, tragedy in the history of Afghanistan. Even, when the Afghan Empire stood tall and championed Islam, they revered and protected the statues of Buddha in Bamyan. But unfortunately, the same Taliban group dynamited them as the world watched, unfortunately, on CNN and BBC and others as UNESCO failed to save, and as well as the UN. And with all due respect to the rapporteur sitting here, so many of them, unfortunately, didn't speak up. They haven't spoken just recently in the lead up to the takeover of much of Afghanistan and the atrocities committed, the war crimes committed. They're all there online. Citizens journalism has really done a lot to capture those scenes of summary executions of civilians, of people having worked with the government, and it's been like the border town that could have killed up to 900 Afghans associated with the government, including relatives, family, friends, etc., and as well as surrendered forces, which was repeatedly broadcast in the lead up to the takeover of Kabul by the Taliban. So the world has betrayed Afghanistan, not just the United States. The neighborhood has done so because they could have averted today's situation. They could do more today to avert this growing humanitarian crisis, the complexity, the deadliness of it. Just consider the convergence of COVID conflict and climate and the breakdown of state institutions. As we speak, there's no service delivery to think, and so many of the electricity pylons that they've destroyed. Now imagine clinics and hospitals without electricity. That also means death. If you have a pregnant woman and take her to the hospital, and a woman are worried and they have not made it to the clinic or hospital because of the fear of the Taliban being in power, and there being no electricity or no water, and or the basic equipment and medicines, much of which has been destroyed, looted, taken away, then you have immediate death on your hands. So it is much worse than the statements that you hear, or either from the Taliban or their state sponsor, or on and off statements from the UN itself, without any action, without any tangible action. That's why last time you and I discussed how hopeful I was that the meeting that took place at the UN Security Council would actually do something about the situation, but it just remained a bunch of statements uttered as usual. So it's a collective failure. It's a collective betrayal of the Afghan people, of our achievements, and a collective betrayal of democracy and human rights and women's rights and the basic liberties and freedoms the rest of the international community enjoys.
Karima, if I can ask you, I know the UN, at least you as a UN Special Rapporteur, had issued a statement just recently raising concerns about the impact this will have on human rights, especially cultural rights. What are your main concerns there?
So thank you very much. And first, I must stress, as a UN Special Rapporteur, I'm an independent expert appointed by the UN, but don't work for or speak for the UN more broadly. But as UN Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights, I yesterday issued a statement with a number of other UN human rights experts warning the world of a human rights and cultural catastrophe in Afghanistan if international action is not taken urgently. First of all, to assist those at risk who need to flee, including human rights defenders, including those who work on women's rights and cultural rights, including artists, people who have worked to defend the cultural heritage, which, as the ambassador rightly points out, has been the subject of attack in the past. There has to be immediate facilitation of departure of those people, including providing them with visas, making sure that the airport is secured and a protected area open to civilians, facilitating civilian flights, making sure that those who make it to other countries are not sent back and are welcomed. And in the medium to long term, making sure that they have the resources to continue their work to defend human rights and culture in exile, which is key to the survival of Afghan culture and society and to preserving the imperfect gains of the last 20 years. There is also an urgent need to support those human rights defenders and cultural workers who are choosing, despite the risks, to stay and continue their work. We must not forget about them. We must ensure and take every step necessary to try to ensure their protection and that they receive support and resources. And I want to stress that there has been a lot of focus on statements being made by the Taliban leadership outside in Doha. And while it may be positive to hear certain statements that perhaps the international community would like to hear, what matters is the deeds on the ground in Kabul and on the ground in the entire country. And I can tell you that I am already receiving worrying reports in the area that I work on, which is the cultural area. Many of them I can't confirm, those need to be confirmed, but they are very grave reports, including of the killing of a writer in Uruzgan, including, I have not been able to confirm this, but of the possible abduction of a young poet, including killings in Kandahar, including the killing of a comedian, including the exclusion of women already in some places, reports of that in the fields of education and employment. And so we need to demand, the international community does, that the Taliban on the ground respect international humanitarian law and human rights and protect cultural sites, as the leadership in Doha said in rather general terms that they would. But I think we have every reason to be concerned about the repetition of the gross abuses of the past, including destruction of cultural heritage, for which there has never been any accountability.
And without an international presence in Afghanistan, how would one actually even, monitor this independently and hold the Taliban accountable for all these gross violations?
And that is the most important question. There needs to be ongoing verification and observation of the situation on the ground. I was very pleased to see a strong statement from the UN today of its commitment to maintain its presence in Afghanistan, but I certainly hope that the verification and observation capability will be continued and increased. And I really make a plea to the international media not to have a short attention span. I fear the Taliban may seek to play a waiting game. As an Afghan woman said to me yesterday on the phone, we have the watch, but they have the time. In other words, they are, it's the human rights defenders who have to watch carefully what's happening, but the Taliban, they fear, may be playing a waiting game until the international media and the international community loses interest. And that is perhaps when we fear there may be a very serious escalation in abuses, which are already being reported. And so that is the critical piece, the verification, the monitoring, and the international responsibility. What happens in Afghanistan is certainly the responsibility of Afghan authorities and those who take power in the country, but it is also an international responsibility. And as the first statement issued on Monday by a very large group of UN special rapporteurs said, this is a test for the UN Charter. The Afghan people are a part of what the Universal Declaration of Human Rights calls the human family. And if we fail this part of the human family at this time, it really reflects great weakness in the international system and is absolutely unjust.
And I know you emphasize on the fact that you're an independent expert here, but isn't there an opportunity here for independent experts to actually exert pressure on the UN as an organization to act now and do something about this situation?
We are, as special rapporteurs, able to criticize many different actors, and we have done that in the past through multiple channels. And I think it is important to hold all sort of the layers accountable here, failures at the national level, failures at the international level, failures of second governments. I think all of these need to be addressed. And I think within the UN human rights system, we have to be very strategic in the coming days. At the moment, I have to say my absolute top priority is on the ability of people to be evacuated swiftly if they feel that they need that, to have access to the airport, to have visas, access to civilian flights, and then to be welcomed in other countries. And what I'm afraid of, one of the things I've noted is that many of us are trying to raise many cases of specific at-risk figures, but we are being told to go from government to government to government. And no one seems to be taking responsibility for having an effective mechanism to do this now. And certainly the UN also can play an important role here, and I hope that it will do so. But that is my immediate focus on the ability of people to leave safely. And I fear that there may be a short window of time in which this can occur.
Ambassador, if I can switch over to you. The US president in his statement the other day criticized the Afghan president and the Afghan security forces, saying they are responsible for what Afghanistan is going through right now, that they did not defend their own country. How would you respond to that?
First, I think the passion with which the rapporteur has just spoken, I really wish that everyone were like her, not just now to react to what is unfolding, a tragedy, but just over the past at least 2 years, at least the past year, at least the past 6 months, at least the past 3 months, at least the past month, we had not seen this kind of reaction. I've been tweeting, I've been writing, I've been interviewing about this, unfortunately, but we didn't have this. It is only happening now simply because everyone have just woken up and they're seeing such a humanitarian tragedy right before us. And that runs directly counter to everything that the Charter is all about, everything that, human rights law and humanitarian law and the rest. But to the point of President Biden blaming us, I think he needs to first and foremost blame, I think, the various administrations in the past, beginning from President Bush, when we recall that he abandoned Afghanistan, shortchanged Afghanistan in 2003 for Iraq, when they invaded Iraq, and that effectively send a wrong message to the neighborhood, to the state sponsor of the Taliban, basically telling them that we are leaving and now you can reconstitute the Taliban and deploy them back. That's exactly what happened. And that's where the original sin began. And then up to 2009, not much was being done because Afghanistan became a war of what we can, while Iraq became a war of what we must, in the words of the former chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mike Mullen. And then when President Obama campaigned, he differentiated between the wrong war and the right war. And then once he came into power, he surged troops, but he announced a timetable to withdraw the US NATO forces by the end of 2014, which happened, although there wasn't much of transition, simply because they've not done enough to build the capacity of the Afghan National Army and the police and properly equip them, including the maintenance and logistics and close air support, so that we would not have dependent in the way that we had grown to up until, the past few weeks, where, once these enablers were removed and withdrawn, we were completely powerless. And then the Trump administration, we know that he cut this deal, and he was very proud of his deal with the Taliban through what I term coercive mediation, carried out by very successfully, unfortunately, by the Special Envoy Ambassador Khalilzad, that gave so much to the Taliban without getting anything from them back, including forcing us to make an unprecedented concession by releasing over 5,000 dangerous terrorists and drug traffickers, hoping that the Taliban would deliver on their commitments of reducing violence and declaring a ceasefire, cutting ties with Al-Qaeda, preventing the released prisoners from returning to the battlefield, and engaging in serious results-driven peace talks, none of which materialized. And then comes President Biden and intent on delivering on what Trump had initiated, simply because of the dynamics of the domestic politics, maybe other reasons as well. And he, as a result, seen the consequences of his decision in contradiction to the advice that he was given by his own advisors, civilian and especially military, because the military knew that with this residual force at a very low cost and at the risk of no American lives being lost the past 2 years, especially the last year, and certainly before they did that, because it was the Afghan forces which had been fighting the Taliban since the end of the transition process in 2014. So US was really losing nothing by remaining in Afghanistan, to use that leverage that we needed so that our forces could continue fighting as they had. That's why we lost over 65,000. I think the numbers are even higher, and so many hundreds of thousands wounded. And imagine losing plus more than 10,000 civilians, including those wounded, which is one of the key products of UNAMA and Afghanistan. It's it's not that much, unfortunately. So that's one of the, I often say, principal products of the UN and Afghanistan is this biannual death report, civilian casualties as a result of the attacks and offensives by the Taliban. So President Biden has enough to blame, I think, the previous administrations, on which he only built and basically implemented the fiasco that was initiated by his predecessor, Republican Donald Trump.
Ambassador, we also see some countries are already expressing their intention or interest in probably, negotiating with the Taliban and accepting an administration led by the Taliban. What does this mean for the future of Afghanistan if the international community actually accepts the Taliban and starts working with them?
Well, I hope they won't. I mean, they've been saying that they will not, including Russia, because they also know what the Taliban stand for. But they're also geostrategic, strategic self-interest, and that involves a number of countries. And they themselves don't have, good records on human rights or democracy. Forget about it, and etc. And so that remains to be seen. And the Afghan people, that's why when I talk about betrayal of Afghans, not just by the key allies, but also the neighborhood, is because of that everyone actually, at the end of the day, is looking after their self-interest, only exploiting, the international system. My colleague just pointed out, or the, giving lip service to the international laws, humanitarian law or human rights law, or going to the UN, or giving the statements in the Security Council meetings and sessions, so forth. But at the end of the day, they just do exactly what they serves their interests. And I've seen female diplomats, for God's sake, from, I would say, kind of very secular state that has been advocating or being silent for the Taliban and their return. And so you see that it is not so much about, laws, norms, principles, and human rights and human rights declaration and so forth, but that it is at the end of the day the self-interest of the state very narrowly defined, and as a result victimizing weak states that are unfortunately on the one hand positively looking, good geography, but negatively looking as we are and is geographically cursed, being located in a hereditary neighborhood with an environment that everyone tries to prey on Afghanistan.
Karima, if I can come back to you, with so many Afghans leaving their country and moving and seeking refuge in other countries, is there a risk that, when they are settled in a foreign nation, that they may, get sort of, poor treatment, be mistreated, and, that they would not actually be able to enjoy the similar rights that, maybe citizens in that respective country would enjoy?
This is also another serious concern. I did a report for the UN Human Rights Council back in 2017 about the impact of fundamentalism and extremism on cultural rights. And one of the things that I strongly recommended is the protection of those who flee from extremists. And I expressed the grave fear that sometimes people then are victims of a second extremism. This is potentially anti-immigrant sentiment or far-right extremism in the West or anti-Muslim sentiment in other places. And that is something we absolutely have to work against and be very clear that most Afghans are opponents of the Taliban. Their cultural practices have nothing to do with the Taliban vision of Afghanistan. And in fact, I think one of the things that's been very distressing in recent days is the sort of blaming of Afghans collectively for the situation that they're in. I have had the honor of visiting Afghanistan 3 times in the past before I became special rapporteur, and I have never seen such brave people resisting extremists through culture, through human rights activism, through education and teaching. And I think we have to really make that message very clear going forward. But you're certainly right. That is a risk that I'm also concerned about. And I was very sorry to hear a European official this morning saying that he does not want to see sort of floods of refugees coming to the EU. We need to make sure that there is a warm welcome for those who are fleeing persecution, who do not wish to flee, but find themselves with no other alternative at this time.
Isn't there a bigger role that Afghanistan's immediate neighbors can play in this situation? I mean, we're hearing a lot from various other countries, Western nations, but very little from South Asia and, Afghanistan's immediate neighbors.
I was very pleased to see just now on the internet images of an Indian women's protest in support of Afghan women. I think regional action is critically important. While there's a global responsibility, absolutely, regional action right now can play a key role. And I really call on, as I called on globally, I now call on South Asian cultural and educational institutions to open their doors, to extend invitations to Afghan students and cultural workers, especially those who are women or members of minorities, so that they can safely continue their studies and their work elsewhere for the duration of the time that is necessary. And I think really showing that regional leadership can teach an important lesson to a world which is currently failing.
And what should the immediate steps be that, UN agencies and, world bodies should be taking at this moment? Since, I mean, we basically see a situation where the Taliban is here to stay. What should be done immediately to ensure that all these rights are protected? There are calls as well for, to ensure that there are sanctions imposed on the Taliban. There are, that there's a freeze on assets. Should those also be measures? Would that affect the people there?
And some of that is beyond my mandate to be able to comment on, but I certainly believe that you are correct that the entire international system and the entire UN system needs to react with urgency. In the first statement from the joint special rapporteurs of the UN human rights system on Monday, we called on the Security Council to act effectively, and I would reiterate that call and all relevant UN bodies to be involved in providing humanitarian assistance, certainly in monitoring of the human rights situation on the ground, and one of the absolute top priorities in making sure that the airport is a protected zone and that those who need to be able to access the airport to leave the country safely can do so. And I absolutely agree with the ambassador that it is a failing when we collectively, internationally, including the media, only react when there is already a crisis, and we don't act preventively over time as an entirely predictable crisis is coming. And now that there is global attention on this tragic situation, that attention has to continue.
Ambassador, I know there are certain Afghan officials who are part of, the Afghan government who are still remaining in Afghanistan. What happens to them? I mean, what is of their security and their safety?
Well, that's quite uncertain. That's why I was talking about the announcement by the Taliban of a general amnesty, especially reassuring senior government officials who are still in Kabul that they are protecting them, that nothing would happen to them, and so on and so forth. But like I said, home searches have already begun. There are footages online that you can check, and it shows that armed people do show up behind people's doors, whether they are robbers, criminals, or whether they're Taliban. This is such an uncertain environment, unfortunately. And so it's really difficult, and that's why everyone tries to leave if they could. But also there's an issue of the, people's disagreement with what the Taliban will bring upon them or introduce this, limited Sharia to which the Afghans are not, used to. Remember, Afghans are, deeply devout Muslims. But Islam in Afghanistan is very different from Islam in Pakistan or the Middle East. And, Islam is so vast and very much mixed with local cultures and civilizations that in many instances, the role of civilization or culture is more dominant than the role of Islam, especially in a country like Afghanistan, which is such a long history that, predates Islam by thousands of years. And so but the Taliban's understanding and view on the Salafism and, other schools that have contributed to their thinking, as much as they're not really educated on Islam, they simply, went to certain madrasas where they were only made memorize Holy Quran without understanding what, the Holy Quran says. So, which means brainwashed and indoctrinated and used for military purposes to achieve, their state sponsors' strategic ends. So they're not really much of any mullah to begin with, or with any knowledge of true Islam. And so that's what people fear. That's what people, this limited view of Islam, understanding of Islam, knowledge of Islam. As a result, it's not only their immediate physical security and concern, but also, life under the Taliban is something that they, don't agree with, not necessarily fear, but it's a combination of these concerns, short-term, but also long-term. And that's why so many thousands of Afghans are trying to get out for both reasons.
I'm afraid we're running out of time, so we'll have to leave it at that. Thank you, Ambassador, for joining us. Thank you, Garima, for taking time to join us on our program. That's all the time we have for you on Daily Mirror World Focus. Till next time, stay safe.